right, welcome back. Okay, we're going to continue our episode, and this time we're going to look at another example, and this time we're going to look at Tamar's near-death experience in Genesis chapter 38. Just give you a little bit of background about that story. You'll remember that Judah had married, and he had 3 sons, and his first son, was wicked before Adonai, and so it says Adonai slew him. And then he was supposed to, and then Onan, who was the next son, he was supposed to marry Er's wife, okay, because when died, he left a widow. Her name was Tamar. And so Onan was supposed to go in unto her and have a child for and was the firstborn. Well, Onan, he didn't do this because he knew that the child would not be his, but would be counted as his brother's, and that therefore that child would be the firstborn. Onan, he wanted the firstborn, right? Okay, and so he took means so that he would not impregnate Tamar, and that didn't please Adonai, and so it says Adonai slew him also. And then Judah had one more son, and his name was Shelah. And he was very young at the time. So Judah basically told Tamar, just go hang out at your father's until he grows up, and then I'll give him to you. Well, inside Judah was like, there's no way I'm going to give Shelah to her, because at that time they kind of felt that she was an Isha Katlanit, which is a deadly woman, okay? Because he's like, every time I give her one of my sons, my son dies. So he really did not intend on giving Shelah to her. Well, the story goes on, and Tamar, she feels that she realizes that Judah is not going to give her Shelah. And so what she does is she dresses herself as a harlot and seduces Judah. Judah goes into her, impregnates her, and then the news comes out that she is pregnant. So if we go to Genesis chapter 38, we can read a portion of that story, Genesis 38. And it says here, and remember when she had relations with Judah, she took his signet, cord, and staff as a surety. And let's see here. So it goes on, and let's see, verse 24. And it came to pass about, now listen to this time frame, it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out here to be burned. When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whom these belong, I am with child. She says, please determine whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff. So Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he never knew her again. Okay, so what's going on there is he has been caught in his devices, and so this is another classic story of someone who's supposed to die. They wind up living in the number 3. Okay, this is a thematic setup that the Scripture gives us to teach about resurrection on day 3. And in this story, it is Tamar who escapes death. It is Tamar who, because of her pregnancy, it is said that she is a harlot, and therefore Judah, he pronounces the sentence, let her be burned, okay? So here we have a situation where she is supposed to die, right? Okay? Then she produces the cord, the signet ring, and she produces the 3 items, right? And then her sentence is commuted and she's able to live. And we see the number 3 because it was 3 months after she became pregnant that this happened. And so again, what we see here is a picture, not literal death, but a picture of her death, in the sense that a death sentence had been pronounced upon her. and then she is able to live. That death sentence is taken away, and we see the number 3. And again, this is a messianic prophecy right here. This is messianic prophecy. And so, in other words, as I've said in the past, whenever you see someone who's supposed to die, and they wind up living in the number 3, then you know you're in messianic prophecy. The only thing you need to do is you need to try to figure out what is the significance of this story. How does it reflect? How does it bear upon the Messiah, upon who he is or his mission, his work, what he needs to do? And so, for instance, we already seen with the binding of Isaac in the Akedah. It is clearly a picture of Yeshua, of the Father being willing to give up his only begotten Son. Because remember, when Adonai approached Abraham, he said, Abraham, he said, I want you to bring up your son, your only son, whom you love, as a whole burnt offering. Okay, so Abraham is a picture of the Father. Isaac is a picture of Yeshua. Okay, and so Abraham was willing to give up his son, and Isaac was a young man at this time. He was not a little boy. And so at some point when Abraham was binding him, Isaac could have said, no, we're not doing this. You need to go find some other sacrifice. Where's that lamb you said Adonai was going to provide, right? I mean, that's what he could have said, but he didn't do that. He willingly laid down his life. So we saw that Isaac was carrying the wood that he was going to die on. Isaac lays down, allows his father to bind him. So Isaac is laying down his life, and we see that is clearly a picture of Yeshua and his execution. Okay, so that's what we learned. That's what we learned from Isaac. From Moses, we learned about Yeshua's birth. Okay, the story of Moses' birth was actually a veiled prophecy of Yeshua's birth, of the events that would occur at Yeshua's birth, how Herod would have all of the male children killed. From Joseph, from that story where we saw life, death, and the number 3, we learned about Yeshua's incarceration with 2 other people. One would live, have eternal life. The other died in his sins, and the whole idea of remember me, the exact words that were used in the story of Joseph. Okay, and then, and so now we're here with this story. Of Tamar. And so the question is, well, what is the messianic significance of this story? I mean, we see this sign of the Messiah, or we see this instance here where she almost dies, she lives, and then we see the number 3. And so what we need to do is let's just read the ending of the story here, starting in verse 28 in chapter 38, and verse 27 in chapter 38. Now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was when she was giving birth that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Peretz. Afterwards, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Okay, now, so in this story, what happens is Zerah is actually one that came out first. He stuck his hand out. The midwife tied a red cord around his hand, but then his hand went back, and then so that was Zerah, and then Peretz came out first. Well, if you go and you look, and so now normally through the genealogy, it's the firstborn who gets the blessing, and it's the firstborn who gets leadership, okay? And so Zerah, who stuck his hand out first, he is the one who should have gotten leadership, etc. Well, when you go and you look in the genealogy of Yeshua, you will see that the genealogy went through Peretz, not Zerah, and Peretz was born second, not first, okay? It's the same thing that happened with Jacob and Esau, right? Esau was born first, but the blessing went through Jacob, okay? And this is a familiar story, just like Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh came before Ephraim, but Ephraim got the blessing. And so the same thing happened with these. So the messianic significance here is that this story is establishing the lineage of the Messiah, because Messiah, his lineage went through Tamar and through Peretz instead of Zerah, who was the actual firstborn. Okay, so again, All of these stories that involve someone being brought to death's door and then living, they are all stories, and when you see the number 3, they are all messianic prophecies. They all have messianic content to them, and we just need to put on our thematic thinking caps, compare what we see to the New Testament, and then we can see that. I mean, even without the New Testament, you understand what's going on from these stories just thematically. Okay? All right. So let's look at Daniel in the lion's den. That's in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 28. This is just a classic example. This is right up there with Jonah and the big fish, where there's no, when somebody gets swallowed by a fish, there's no way they're supposed to live, right? Okay. Well, the same thing happens here. Okay. And again, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for how the Tanakh teaches resurrection on day 3. How does the Tanakh teach resurrection on day 3? And so what we're doing now in this last set of categories is we're looking at instances of people who give us a picture of death and resurrection in their lives. They are brought to death's door. It's as if they die, and then they wind up living. And as we saw last time with Rav Elchanan Samet from Har Etzion Yeshiva, he sees all of these instances of death and then resurrection. He simply calls them death and rebirth, but they're clearly seen thematically. If we're studying thematically, it's clear to see these things. So, like I said, very similar to Joseph and to Jonah and the big fish. There were a number of 3s in the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel was one of 3 advisors who ruled over the 120 satraps of the kingdom of Babylon. It says a couple of times that he prayed 3 times a day, right? Remember King Darius was tricked into an ill-advised law, right, that almost cost Daniel his life, that whoever prayed to any other god or asked anything from any other king except for Darius for the next 30 days would have to be thrown into the lion's den, right? Now think of this. What's going to happen to your average person who is thrown into a lion's den, right? What's going to happen to them? They're going to die, right? There's no way they're going to survive. And so clearly, when they take Daniel and they throw Daniel into the lion's den, and then notice what it says. It says after they threw him into the lion's den, it says that they rolled a stone over the mouth of the lion's den. Now, what should that remind you of? It should remind you of Yeshua going into the grave, you see. So when Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, they seal the tomb. It's sealed with the king's signet, okay? Just like in the New Testament, they rolled the stone over Yeshua's grave, and then it was sealed with Pilate's seal. So this is clearly a picture of death. Okay, he is going down into death. Now, there are a number of pictures. There's more than one picture here. Number 1, he is going into a lion's den. That equals death. Number 2, he's going into a pit. That is death, because the scripture teaches that when you go into a pit, that it is as if you have died. Okay, it's as if you have died. So he goes in to death. Just like Jonah went into the fish, should have died, and then the next day, Daniel comes out alive. So he walks back out through the mouth of the lion's den, and that is clearly a picture of resurrection. He has conquered death, as it were. And so again, this story of Daniel, in the teaching that I did called The Sign of the Messiah, which is available here on HRN, what we do is we take the story of Daniel and we show you how the story of Daniel is actually a moving video of everything that you see in the gospel account, beginning with Yeshua's temptation in the garden, all the way through his death, burial, and resurrection. Everything is there. The jealousy of the Pharisees trying to get him in trouble. Everything in the story of Daniel is a literal prophecy. Everything in the story of Daniel in the lion's den is a literal prophecy of what you read in the gospel account. And so, of course, I would definitely suggest that you look at that. Again, that's the teaching entitled The Sign of the Messiah. Okay, so, and then we're going to look at another example here. We're going to look at the example of the three Hebrew children. So we have the three Hebrew youth, these Na'ars, okay, as Elchanan Samet so keenly observed, that they defied King Nebuchadnezzar's decree to worship the image of gold, okay? And so the penalty for their defiance was that they had to be thrown into a hot, fiery furnace. And so again, we see how many Hebrew children were there? 3, right? And just like Jonah and just like Daniel, there's no way they're going to live, right? There's no way you're going to be thrown into this furnace that's heated 7 times hotter than what it normally is. So they take the 3 children, they throw them, cast them into the fiery furnace. And instead of dying, they live. And they wind up walking out of the fiery furnace, okay? And so through miraculous intervention, their lives are saved. This is yet another story of death and resurrection, not literal death and not literal resurrection, as in the case of the widow of Zarephath's son, or the Shunammite woman's son, or the man's corpse that was thrown onto Elisha's bones that was resurrected. Okay, not literal bodily death and then resurrection, as in those 3 instances from the Tanakh. But in this case, there are numerous people who thematically, or in a picture form, they are brought to death and then resurrected again. And so, there are just numerous examples of this, and it all goes to do one thing. It all goes to associate the number 3 with the resurrection, with the idea or the concept of resurrection. So what we see is that it's clearly taught, in the Tanakh. It has its roots and its foundations there. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start. There are many other ways. One of them ways of seeing this idea of resurrection on day 3. One of them has to deal with chiastic structures, and I'm not going to get into that, but I've got some of that on my website. Some of the audio-visual lessons for the Torah portions and some of the YouTubes. I've got some specific YouTubes on chiastic structures, which are just basically the literary patterns in how the stories are written. All of the stories in the Tanakh, all of the stories in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, are told in thematic patterns called either parallelisms or chiastic structures. And as you begin to analyze the pattern of words, this is not anything very difficult to do. But as you begin to analyze the patterns, the chiastic structures and the parallelisms, even the chiastic structures and the parallelisms teach resurrection on day 3. They're a little involved. I have to have a lot of slides to show what it is, so I'm not going to actually show that. And so what we're going to do is, I think what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a final note here about, well, when I say a final note, we've got a few more teachings to do. But I want to talk to you about kind of what inspired me to do this teaching called Resurrection in the Tanakh. Okay, I didn't talk about this at the beginning, but there is something that really inspired me to do this teaching, and it has to do with a book that I read entitled The Last Trial on the Legends and the Lore of the Command of Abraham to Offer Isaac as a Sacrifice. It's written by Shalom Spiegel, who has passed away. This book was written a while back. And this book, what he was trying to do is this. He was trying to determine the sources of the midrashim which speak of Isaac's quote-unquote death and resurrection. Now, let me talk to you about that a little bit. The midrashim, what are the midrashim? Many of the Jewish sages of antiquity, and this goes even before the 1st century, they wrote stories called midrashim or midrash. And what they did was they would take a biblical narrative, let's say the binding of Isaac, okay? They would take that narrative and now you notice that when you read biblical stories, quite often they don't have a lot of detail, right? I mean, when you think about the binding of Isaac, I mean, it's basically from Genesis chapter 22, I think like verse 1 through 19 is basically the story. So in 19 verses, you've got the story of the binding of Isaac. Now, there's a lot of information missing in that story. I mean, it's not very complete. I mean, you hear about Isaac saying, you know, hey, the wood and the fire, where's the lamb? And then, you know, Abraham says, you know, God will provide himself a lamb, right? And then the next thing you know, Abraham is like tying Isaac. Well, what happened to that conversation? I mean, obviously, right? Because as of the time Abraham answers his question, you know, Isaac's just kind of walking along thinking, okay, yeah, you know, Adonai is going to provide a lamb. Okay, cool. So I guess when we get here, you know, my father's faith, a lamb will come out somewhere or whatever. Now, that's where we're left off in the story. And then the next thing you know, when we turn around and it's like, Isaac is being bound on the altar. Well, now, wait a second. I'm sure that there was a conversation there. I know that he didn't just start binding him and throw him up on the altar and Isaac just never said anything. Of course, there was something said. So anyway, the whole point here is that in many of the biblical stories, there are a lot of details missing. So this is where the Midrashim come in. And in the Midrashim, what the Jewish sages did is this. They added some extra, they would tell the story again, but they would add all sorts of details, you know, just that weren't in the text. I mean, they'd add all sorts of, like, for, you know, one of the Midrashim, it says that Isaac was literally killed. It says that Abraham actually slew Isaac in the Midrashim, and it says that Isaac lost a log of blood. I don't know how much a log of blood is, but it was a certain quantity. And another Midrashim said that what happened is that Isaac, that he literally died, and then that God resurrected him, and that he was taken up to heaven, where he was healed he was in heaven 3 years, it says in the Midrashim, okay? So, and then there are other Midrashim that have all sorts of other embellishments upon the story of Isaac and the binding of Isaac, the Akedah or Akedah. So the first thing that I want to say is that the Midrashim are not true. Okay, that's the first thing. This is a fact. They are not true. Now, if you listen to Jewish people, many Jewish people will tell you that they're true. Rabbis will tell you that they're true, but they are not true. Okay, they are not factual at all. Okay, these are attempts by the rabbis to fill in the details of the narrative. Now, there is a lot to learn from them because the rabbis of antiquity who came up with these midrashim, they were thoroughly trained thematically, okay? This is how they were able to fill in the gaps, because they would make thematic connections from the story at hand to other stories, and in other words, they would read the one story they're analyzing, and they'd see a bunch of thematic connections to another story in the Bible. And so then what they would do is they would take information from the other story and incorporate it into the one that they were analyzing. And so again, so then you're looking at this one and analyzing, and you're like, oh, look, there's a whole bunch of thematic connections between this story, the binding of Isaac, over here, and here's an example right here. There are a lot of thematic connections here between the binding of Isaac and the story of the Shunammite woman's son and his resurrection. So they incorporated themes from that into this story. Now, on the other hand, there are a lot of thematic connections between the binding of Isaac and what we read over in Genesis 18 and 19. In Genesis 18 and 19, where Abraham is serving dinner to his three guests on what appears to be Passover. Because notice that Abraham served them matzah. It's a hint that it was Passover. And so what they do is the masters of the Midrashim, they saw so many thematic connections between the story of Isaac and the Akedah and the account of Abraham and the three visitors. So they'll pull some of the information out of that story and they'll tuck it into the story of the binding of Isaac. And so they do that with different stories. They bring information in, and it's all based on thematic connections, okay? It's all utterly based on thematic connections. Now, were they right to do that? No. But were they correct in making the thematic connections to the other stories? You betcha. And Adonai wanted them to do that, and he wants us to do that. But the idea, though, is you have to understand, why does he want you to make those thematic connections? This is so that you can change and totally embellish the story so that it actually says the opposite of what the story says. In other words, the story is clear that Abraham did not slay Isaac, okay? So then we cannot come up with a story that says that, well, you know, Abraham really slew him. Well, no, that didn't happen. So the Midrashim are not true, but they are very valuable. So what Shalom Spiegel is trying to do is this. When you start looking, this is pretty amazing. We're not going to be able to finish today, but when you start looking at the Midrashim, you're going to start noticing a lot of similarities between what the Midrashes say and what you read in the New Testament concerning Yeshua and his death, burial, and resurrection. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that with you, and then we'll pick back up on it the next time when we come. But the Midrashim are very similar to what you read in the gospel account. And so we want to look at that when we come back, kind of figure out why is that, and we want to look at why Shalom Spiegel wrote his book, and I'll have some comments about that.